as has been the case for the previous videos, I'm going to have all of the mixes I made down in the description, so if you wanted to look at them, you can find them there. Instead, in this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be talking about the education system, where I think certain things are failing, and I'm not just going to complain about it, but I'm going to try and offer a solution. This video is being recorded before the last one with the music comes out, and I really do kind of suspect that that video is not going to do as well, but it's worth the experiment. So before we get into this, I really want to just point out, I want to use a quote talking about the education system, and I want to use two quotes. Both of them are going to be from Haruki Murakami's Norwegian Wood. And one is that if you only read the books that everyone else is reading, you can only think what everyone else is thinking. And that's huge, huge in itself. Love that quote. But then there's this one that really helps all teachers with being able to explain why you're learning what you're learning. Am I ever going to use this? So I'm going to take this, and I am chopping it up a little bit to part of a conversation that goes on. And it says, can you explain the difference between an English subjective present and the subjective past? Then what purpose does stuff like this serve in daily life? None at all. It may not serve any concrete purpose, but it does give you some kind of training to help you grasp things in general, more systematically. And I think that's it right there, where people really miss that the purpose of going to school is to learn how to acquire and integrate that information into your head. But we do as educators, because if you were not aware, I'm a teacher, so my picking on schools is not, I just want to complain about it as a teacher complaining about something. Not at all. This is a script that I've had written for a while. It's a script that I've more or less referred to as the one that ends my career, but I would really hope not. First, I want to talk about attendance. It is obvious to say that learning is much more difficult for those not present, though not impossible if that person is autodidactic. Now, it has been normal for schools to have an attendance policy, though over the years, the policy has changed significantly. I'm old, but when I was in school, the limit of absence was 10 in a year, and as we will see, times have changed. A few years ago, the state decided that a child cannot fail for attendance, specifically that it was against the state's constitution for a student to have an academic punishment over a behavior. Sounds reasonable as somebody acts out in class and so they fail an assignment. An immediate result of this change, though, was that you got what you expected. There was a boost in the graduation rate. If you took everybody that did not attend class and said they can't fail for that, they can't fail an assignment because they were not there. So there's not a grade. This was short-lived, the graduation boost, as students quickly figured out the game. You can't fail if you aren't there. This brings us to the next step in the attendance saga, which is unenrollment. As it turns out, if a student shows up late to one class, then leaves school early every 14 days, yes, one late to one class for 2 weeks, 10 school days, then the student stays enrolled. Let's take a brief side trip and talk about tardy. When I was in school, more than 3 tardies or lates were considered an absence. When I started teaching over 10 years ago, then it was 5 minutes late was considered absent. But now we've moved to the point that 15 minutes is still considered late. But on the 16th minute, then it's absent. This is a 45-minute class-ish. We need to get back onto the attendance line of thought. Our attendance warning indicators are at 3, 10, and 15 days per quarter. It means that if the attendance isn't really that important, But the sad reality is that school funding has a lot to do with school counts. And this is only at certain times of year. So you don't want them dropped off too early because that gets the money, especially if you consider how this connects with discipline. Attendance is very closely connected with discipline. What happens if a child is just skipping class far too often? Well, we'll come back to that before we get to really when we talk discipline. The child we should ask is what the teacher has done to fix the problem. So when a student is constantly not in class, instead of trying to figure out anything from the student, we go straight to the teacher and say, why aren't they coming to your class on time or at all? What are you doing to make them show up to class? Which is weird because I have to stand in a hall between classes. I can't chase people down, but we push this to the teacher. In the case of excessive absences, a teacher must first call home, maintain call logs for each call, as the first 3 get phone calls home. Then, on the 4th, the teacher must fill out a form for discipline team to hold a restorative circle. This is where they gather together and talk about what's going on to work with correcting this issue. Let's not forget that it is particularly on the teacher for not being so much fun that the kid would rather go to class than play video games at home. I don't think continuing on attendance progression will show more than it already has. So it's sufficient to really kind of stop here. Everything that comes up with them not being there says, why is the teacher not making it so compelling to be there that they have to? So we can come back to discipline for excessive absences or more frequent skipping. The school stance on disciplining these students would only result in more absences from the school entirely. There, they won't learn. So make of that what you will. So if somebody does not skip, they are not going to wind up being suspended. And that, in its certain way, makes sense. Now they're not in school, then they cannot learn. The real issue is how to deal with this. How can we enforce attendance? I know we used to enforce attendance with truancy officers when I was young. I would like to see the return of the truancy officer and the policy conversation with the parent, because the parents more frequently will just give, but I dropped them off at school. Yes, that's great. You dropped them off at school. They still need to make it to class. That conversation has to be had. After all, there is a homeschooling option that can be used for the parent that isn't going to get their kid to go to class once they're once they're at school. Along with that, there needs to be a hard line at some number of absences that says if you're not there, then you're not able to learn, you're not able to progress to the next class. As a school, we have no way to make sure that a child actually gets to the school. Once at school, at my school, tardy sweeps are regularly done where students are, I'm going to call it, captured and brought to class. I'd kind of like to hear whatever your suggestion might be on how to improve attendance in the school in the comments. If you have one, it would be helpful. I could bring it up to my administration. Well, what about homework? So they increased the graduation rate temporarily by doing away with attendance. So then we get to the issue of homework. In the learning of any skill, there must be practice. In the case of school, that is homework. It's important to first note that it is high school where students have 7 classes and every teacher that gives them approximately 30 minutes of homework, then the student has 3.5 hours of homework every single night. It adds up very quickly and can easily become overwhelming, causing the student to do none of it. There is an added problem of grading homework. We are then essentially grading practice. It needs to be a judgment-free opportunity to make mistakes, so that grades for this should not be on correctiveness, but on complete in its try. Now, while I don't think it should be graded for just correctiveness, I do think that we should be grading them on doing the practice. Think of it as sports. I've never had a bad practice when I was an athlete, and as a result of having bad practice, we received penalties at the beginning of the next game. We need the opportunity to have that bad practice, just as good practice never added points to us in a game. In my county, they use the example of the mythological student that does well on everything in class, but then they don't do their homework and as a result fail the class because of the homework part of the grade. To counter this, they passed a rule in that correcting the homework, the teacher can't grade it. Of course, this actually means, as it would be told to the teachers, that we cannot have a homework grade. Not at all. You can't look at it and say you've done 50% of it. This would include a grade that gives points just for doing the work and not for not basing the grade on correctness. So you can't even say you did all the practice, here's your practice points, here's that point. You can't. Naturally, then, there's no homework given and no practice is done by the student trying to learn. Let's think about this for just a moment. There's no practice because you can't grade it, which means when it's not graded, most students are not going to even do it. There's no reason for them to do it, at least they think not. So let's back up and remember the failing because of homework part of the grade. In that straw man case, the student is somehow doing well in the class on tests, according to them. They never prepared for it. They haven't practiced. Why would they? It is the homework that aids in the reinforcement of the lesson. Then they go to do well on the test. Or simply, the test is the result of the practice. The people at the top making the decision have somehow forgotten what is needed to actually teach and learn with the importance of practice. I find it very rare as a teacher that a student could do no homework but actually still do well on the test. The homework is the practice for game day being the test. Outside of school, as in after school, anyone that works to advance in their field is bound to spend personal time reinforcing the basics and studying new skills as the new skills open doors for advancement in their career. We need homework because it teaches us the skills that we use later in our careers. But I would say if it would be graded, then grade the effort, not the accuracy. Again, back to when I played sports, never having received points or penalties based on how well I practiced or how hard I worked in practice. Although the unseen result is someone who works extremely hard in practice tends to play much better. Doesn't mean they're going to win the game. It does mean that that individual's effort gets to be much better in the game because they've practiced high effort. Once again here, what do you think on whether homework should be graded, homework should be given, or even how should it really be graded at all? So we need to move on to assessments in themselves, the mandatory retest. And the thing that goes on sometimes is they say that in life there are no do-overs. And that's what they use to tell us. But it's false. When I was a kid and you got told, no, you get no second chances in the real world you do. You get your car fixed, but the mechanic makes a mistake. They'll fix the mistake and you don't pay for the second time. This is a do-over. In the industry, this is called a comeback. my county, or maybe just the school, decided to make it mandatory that the student be allowed to retest as many times as needed for tests they failed. Further, it is the higher score that is entered into the gradebook and that they can earn full value. This means you can take a test 20 times and then get 100 on the 20th time. This is out of alignment with the real world in most every way. Now, sure, the mechanic makes a mistake and gets to fix the problem. And yes, they got paid 100% of the money for their job the first time. When it came back and they didn't get paid for it the second time, so what in effect happened is they earned less because that time is money, and the time spent to fix the mistake was unpaid as it was already paid the first time. So if a job takes an hour and it comes back and it takes an hour again, it took 2 hours to do 1 hour's work, effectively 50% pay. Now, I've always allowed a retest when time is in the graded quarter still allowed it, because you get people that show up on the last day of the quarter wanting to do a ton of work. And imagine yourself an English teacher with 150, 200 students turning in a resubmitted test essay the last day of the quarter. There's no reasonable way for that teacher to actually grade all that. However, I didn't just give them the test again and they had to complete, I wouldn't just say, here's a second go. I would make them do an assignment to earn a retake. Now, this assignment was really designed to make sure that they worked on the skills that they wouldn't be able to have done before. In fact, it was in certain ways made to be a bit harder to force studying for the test before they would be allowed to retest. And on a successful retest, they would earn 80% instead of 100 as max. And I thought this was very fair. To remember, the mechanic that doubled the time to do the job earned 50% money for that time. But I felt 80% was a good place to be. The student of which there would be many doing retests, when they did the work and they did the retest, they were always happy to earn that 80% opposed to what they had in the first place, that F. In all of this, I'm, really purposely ignoring the time and effort on the teacher to strictly look at the effort on the student in what's going on. After all, there's nothing more convenient. There's nothing that should ever be convenient about teaching students. When you have a retest you have to give, you don't just give them the exact same test again. You have to write a new test that is at the same level as the previous test. To be clear, I do agree with retaking or retesting on deficient skills, and that the grade needs to be more closely reflecting of the learning that's being achieved. But there must be a middle ground. That's why I used to remediate assignments that were mandatory before a retake, to reflect the lower max value. The 80%. After all, you should be able to retake or retest students and receive some grade as the student actually is learning later on. I know I'm a bit over in all of this and going around, but there's a lot that's here. We do need to be able to retake. We do redo things in life as adults, and we don't want to ignore all of that. But we want to give give students the skills they're going to need out in the world afterwards. And it's not necessarily the academic skill that we're seeing in the classroom, but it's the real life, intangible, get the work done to a satisfactory level. So we're talking about getting work done to a satisfactory level that does tend to come with deadlines. So at this point, let's talk about late work and deadlines. If you went out to dinner and the food took a long time to arrive, how long is too long? In this context, the school, how late is too late for them to turn the work in? What is the deadline? Now, I can't help but wonder if anything outside of school late here is the same. I can't help but wonder if anything outside of school late here is the same value to you as if it were just on time. And at what point of being late do you not want it at all? If there's a point of late that you don't want that thing at all, then is the deadline is the deadline to things even out of school? And a horrible written sentence here for myself, but to clarify, like if you go out to dinner and it takes 3 hours for your dinner to arrive, you probably don't care about that food when it arrives anymore. Probably left. Now, in my district, we must accept late work at full value, as if it was on time. And are we teaching a realistic idea here? If you pay your mortgage late, sure, they accept it. And yes, they apply 100% of the money, the same as if it were on time. But it does get a late penalty in the form of dollars you have to pay. So it costs you more to pay late. A reduced effectiveness of your money. There must be some way to teach the value of punctuality in your obligations, and a couple of points a day for work being late does seem a bit reasonable. And so does having the max that can be lost in points. If a student is a month late on an assignment and has a 0%, but can now only get a 50% because of how late the assignment is, they're likely not going to do it. The value is doing nothing to them at all, even though they get 50%, which is much higher. I tend to try and convince my students when I'm looking at their grades in classes and say 50 is a much better F than a 0 is. If that's all the teacher is going to give, then be willing to do that. But shouldn't there be some sort of stopping point of losing points? We could say 80% again, that a number high enough to really feel that it's worth doing it, even if it's a month late. Yet we still haven't talked truly about deadlines. The thing about it being late is, when is it too late to matter? I know someone that owns an advertising agency, and on the ads, they make there is deadlines, not because they have to go to print, but because before they can go to print, they have to go through a client's legal department. That way, if something needs to be changed, it can be fixed, and there's time to fix it before it goes into print. If the agency is late, then they must pay the legal overtime to get the ad looked at. So late comes with a cost. It becomes a reduced profit to that advertisement company. Late matters on every single employee. That's the reason we tend to have these deadlines, and then the next level has their own deadlines. Is why we might give soft and hard deadlines to do something. But what about in school? I have about 200 students every year, and thankfully I teach math. So let's talk about it if I were to be an English teacher. If I had all of my students turn in a 1,000-word essay late, but not just late, but on the last day of the quarter, or that marking period, the semester, how is that teacher supposed to grade 200,000 words before the computer gradebook closes? By calling it 200,000 words, imagine having to read 200,000 words and give feedback, just the reading of it, in 3 days. That's the end of the quarter to when the gradebook closes. So 200,000 words just to read it. No thoughts, no feedback, nothing. That's huge. So then they get published. Now, I didn't miss the fact that I only said read and not read and grade. I also realized how unrealistic it is to say that every student turned in a 1,000-word essay last minute. I do realize that's unrealistic. The student deadline, it's a necessity throughout the term so that their work can be actually looked at and graded, given feedback for improvement. As for me, I will stand by my current belief that the late work should come with a penalty in points in some way, and with an absolute deadline that gets held to enforce the idea that in teams everywhere you have deadlines because others are often waiting for you so that they can do their job. So the deadlines for assignments, it's not just about quarters. It's about a skill that we need in the workforce. I think they call these soft skills, but still really important. We're going to move on from the in-class test. We're going to talk about standardized testing. So in education, they frequently say what is measured is improved. These are the guiding words for school boards all across the country, which is what has led to all of these standardized testing getting so out of control. My fourth quarter is absolutely destroyed with standardized testing in so many different subjects. I have no doubts, and likely not to do with that tests need to be verified that learning is actually being achieved, not just some number. Florida has, now it's a different name, it's the best standards test for math, that it's not just math, it has them do most every single subject. In fact, most of our fourth quarter is really spent testing. And rightfully so, if you believe that testing is the most important thing. A student cannot take 2 EOCs in the same day. So a math one and an English one, that's 2 days in testing, that's 2 days not in class. It makes sense as the brain really is it uses the most calories to run than any other organ. And knowing this can help us understand why, if you truly are trying hard on an intense test, you wind up being absolutely exhausted and in need of a nap afterwards. I would say that 1 in a day is pretty much a good policy. It's important at this point to make sure that it's understood that this is not just an end to a year event. Really, what are we testing for? Is it just at the end you've made this check mark? But that's really, then we need to set up baselines and monitoring tests throughout the year. So now instead we have 1 baseline, 3 monitoring tests, 4 for the county, and 1 for the state. That just starts sounding like a lot of testing. Let's not forget that any test that the student didn't pass last year will be retested every 2 to 3 months until they pass it this year. Now, I know that's a lot of testing. Somehow, lessons in learning must be achieved in all this testing time that we get left over from testing. The teaching time is left over from teaching, so we're losing the focus of school. Trying not to be too rambly here. Now, they measure a teacher's effectiveness by the standardized test results. This is where we get to be a problem, that teachers will then teach to the test since student performance on these tests affect the teacher's pay. In all of this, I can only complain about the problem as I don't really have a full solution, but I do think there is one, and that it's that we pay maybe a little bit more attention to how much a student has learned through a year instead of have they reached the high water mark or the acceptable water mark this year. I will point out another flaw that I've seen in this testing system as a teacher, which is when I taught geometry, at that time I used constructions constantly in order to teach all these principles. But that was not a testable skill, how to actually make all this stuff with a straight edge and compass. But constructing everything with straight edge and compass was where we got our full understanding. So I was teaching Euclid's elements and then the algebraic connection. I was told to stop because that was not tested. But the students that had that part, that's the connection of the information. If you go above and beyond what's tested, you will be discouraged in it because that's not the tested skill. My problem tends to turn towards the standard itself. We want to achieve a standard. That's great. But it becomes the end line. So if you stop at the standard, then any lost information means your ability is below the standard. You have to teach to the point of completing the knowledge to actually understand it. Not just, but we have a something and we can put a check in a box. No, teaching to completion of information, not a finish line. So then we have to talk about class interruptions because we've already seen we lose a lot of class time to testing and to attendance and discipline. But what about interruptions? Most classes across the county here, or maybe even across the country, they're about 45 minutes. So 45 minutes of instructional time, except it's not. For this, we're going to ignore the administrative tasks, such as taking attendance in every single class. This is the thing that teachers do that isn't teaching, but is a necessity for the effectiveness of running a classroom. Now, here I want to discuss the interruptions to teaching that occur as, such as phone calls, emails, people not in class, coming to the door late, which is, of course, my favorite activity, next to announcements. We're not going to discuss each of these, but before we get into that, excuse me, before we get into it, we must establish that the teacher computer must be on, and it's an integral part of the emergency contact system, and it's not limited to, but is especially for any incidents that would occur and where the school would need to evacuate or be on lockdown. Let's keep this in mind. Over the course of the school year, I really wanted to keep track of the interruptions, and after the first quarter, I have an average of, 4.5 interruptions per period. And this is averaged over just the first quarter. So if we set this out over the entire year, it's ridiculous. The interruptions per class at 6 classes a day was horrible. The amount of interruptions in a year, I mean, if we added up all of the time, and then we took the time for the testing away, and then we took the time for absences away, and we take the time for being late away, we're losing time. Now, if each interruption was only about 1 minute, we'd probably get about 65 hours of spent time with interruptions. Now, doing this job is just 9 weeks in a quarter. We're going to try and let this sink in, that we're going to lose about 65 hours of instructional time in 9 weeks. 65 hours would be a little bit more than a week and a half. So taking us down to about 7.5 weeks to do the instructional material that's supposed to be 9 weeks. The reason that I used 1 minute for the interruptions, it's important to kind of underestimate, because if it was just the interruptions, but it's also the time that it takes to get the 35 students in the room refocused on the task at hand. So it's not that 20-second announcement. It's getting back to work. Now, I think the need to do here is obvious. And it's that learning needs to be treated as the most important thing, the priority, if you will. And anything that prevents it must really be treated as opposition. With plans on how to eliminate them, I think the phone calls and announcements can be really cut to zero, simply narrowing them down to an emergency only. It sounds simple, except everybody calls everything an emergency because they want it now. To cut down or to, on the late students and the interruptions, I would say that we need to have a tardy policy that makes a certain number of tardies into absences, and then something that actually makes absences have a repercussion. I mean, after all, if you're not at work, you don't get paid. This is trying to really say this whole thing needs to be an eye on the prize kind of category. That we have to treat everything in education as it is about learning how to think about something, and anything that gets in the way of teaching kids how to think is an obstacle for that. So what about discipline? I'm not going to go huge into discipline, just a little bit to say, how does someone start to have a conversation about discipline without overstating the obvious? So I won't here, other than to say that along with discipline must be accountability, or why bother? A plan must be reasonable, it must be set in place, and it must be stuck to. Far too often, I see a discipline policy come out and then gets largely ignored. Now, I do have some personal pet peeves when it comes to it. As a math teacher, a personal pet peeve is other teachers that will devalue my subject with such unprofessional behavior as saying, "Don't ask me, I don't do math." I'd never say such ridiculous things as, "Don't ask me to read and write. I'm not an English teacher." Why would I know what we did yesterday? I'm not a history teacher. These are all like ridiculous things, but as a math teacher, the amount of times I've had teachers really relay that to a student, "Oh, I can't do math." No, you have a bachelor's degree. You have a level of math that exceeds theirs, and you shouldn't be afraid of it. This is just my personal pet peeve. So to all the teachers out there that say these things, please stop. You think you're being funny, but you're making it harder on the kids, the parents, and the teachers. It's okay. I was not good at math. That's the kind of thing parents say to their kid, instead of asking questions and making the student explain it to them. One line at a time. You don't have to understand math perfectly. You can ask questions and make them explain. One of the best ways to get better at something is to explain it to others. I'm now going to just talk kind of quickly, maybe. I don't know. I'm a bit rambly, and I'm not particularly great at just doing this sort of way in the videos, but I'm trying. I'm going to talk about the teacher shortages that are going on. With everything else that's really going on, we can see classrooms packed to capacity. Now, there is a teacher shortage. Why? I have a theory here, and, I think it adds up. And this comes from unintended consequences of doing away with tenure for teachers. Now, the tenure for teachers, it starts with a misunderstanding of what tenure was. So we need to remember that tenure was a tool for teachers to use to fight for what was academically right for their students, without fear of an administrative retaliation. The general public now saw this as teachers had a job security and that bad teachers were protected. Now, the consequences of not having tenure is that to speak out may cost you your job, potentially being blacklisted and unable to return to teaching at all. This causes some good teachers to just simply stay silent. Let's remember that these are people. They are humans that need to pay their rent, they need to buy food, they need to support their family, and that their first priority must be to their family. It's really easy to say, but as a teacher, you're supposed to, and then fill in a whole bunch of things where people want all of the sacrifice from that teacher. But you have to give them the ability to fight over what is right academically for that student. Doing away with tenure created a bunch of yes men doing things they don't support just to get by, all the while trying to keep an academic focus where they know it belongs. So, I mean, it's not that teachers are just being yes men to what comes down. But if you fight against it because you don't believe it's right for the student, that can end your teaching career or end your time at a school. All for simply speaking out. There's no protections. And while we do need parent involvement and input, we need teachers to have the tools to fight for that child in the classroom. A huge tool was tenure. We need tenure to come back to see the community take the classroom back from politicians. When a teacher can side with parents over an issue without having to worry about no longer being a teacher, no longer being able to pay their mortgage or buy their groceries, but they can say, this is what would be right, and I need to do this for this child. We get that when we have tenure. That old teacher you had that would have some initiative come down, and you can remember going, I don't care, I know this is right, and that's what they're doing. They had the protection to do that in tenure. Now, I have to end talking about all of this at some point eventually, and it seems like I could keep going on like this and forever. And instead, it's a matter of trying to really work on an issue that plagues the school system, and it must be done, but everybody has to really work together. And I didn't try to cover all of the problems all at once. We shouldn't try when we're dealing with the school. We have to be measured. We have to start with one. Whichever one you feel like would be the easiest first victory. Just begin with one and see how it can be fixed. So if you were to try and look, and like tenure is probably too huge an issue to actually get. But if you started with the idea of, let's talk about an attendance policy and holding to that, flat holding to it. One fix, choose the easiest fix we can come up with, get an easy victory. Follow through on that one thing, then move to the next thing. Don't try and fix it all because it's too big a change all at once. One item in a year. My wanting to see tenure come back, if it were to work on coming back, I would be gone before it returned. So it's really not going to be affecting me in any kind of way. I hope I wasn't too rambly. I hope I made some kind of sense. I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching.